I will hope that whatever he said was true, but I'll never know. My subject this evening is market failure, and I'm going to argue that market failure is a real problem, that it is a problem in laissez-faire libertarian systems. Therefore, it is an argument for government intervention in the economy. However, it is a stronger argument against government intervention in the economy. That is, I'm going to argue that market failure describes a real characteristic of human action, of human behavior, one which is an occasional problem in the free market and a recurrent normal situation in the political market, which is its alternative. And I want to be explaining first what, in my view, market failure is, why it is an argument against laissez-faire, why it implies that a laissez-faire system will sometimes do the wrong things, but why it is a stronger argument against the alternative to laissez-faire, because market failure is the exception on the private market, but the norm on the political market. And after we finish talking about politics, I want to talk about the relevance of market failure to other things in life, which include marriage, teaching, war, and how to make money. In many different fields, there are technical terms that sound self-explanatory and aren't. It sounds as though if you know the name of something, you know what it is, and frequently you don't. My standard example is the theory of relativity. I am sure there are lots of people out there who in their hearts believe that they understand relativity, except for the mathematical details. That relativity, after all, says that everything is relative, and they understand that. But that's not, in fact, what theory of relativity says. For any physicists in the audience, the theory of relativity says that the speed of light is quite impossibly absolute. Similarly, market failure ought to mean situations where markets fail. But I'm going to argue both that there are ways markets can fail that are not market failure, and that market failure happens in many places other than markets. So that gets us to the question of what is market failure. And the definition that I think is most useful is that market failure is a situation where individual rationality does not lead to group rationality, where each individual correctly acts to achieve his objectives, correctly acts in his own interest, and yet all of us are worse off as a result. And this happens because my act helps me but harms you, your act helps you but harms me. It's not limited to markets. Let me start with my favorite example. I want you to imagine that it's about 1,000 years ago. Those of you with historical interests may want to imagine that you are in Ireland, part of the host led by the Jarl of the Orkney Isles, Sigurd, engaged in a battle with an Irish army commanded by the High King of Ireland. But if you don't like the historical example of Clontarf, take another one. But think of yourself as one of 10,000 men in a line with spears. And your spears are all pointed that way. And the reason they're pointed that way is there are another 10,000 men with spears on horseback coming at you. Actually, the Irish didn't mostly have horses, so you can drop my historical example. Maybe Hastings might be a better example. But in any case, 10,000 of us with spears, 10,000 of them with spears, they're coming at us. And I do a very rapid cost-benefit calculation. If all of us stand and keep our spears planted, with luck we can break their charge. And if we do that, some of us will die, but most of us will live. If we run, horses run faster than we do. So I ought to stand. I'm sorry, I made a mistake. I said we. I don't control him and him. If everybody else stands and I run, one man out of 10,000 will have very little effect on the chance we'll stop the charge, and I won't be one of the ones who gets killed. If everybody else runs and I stand, I'm dead. Whatever everyone else is going to do, I am better off running. Everybody sees the logic of that situation, and for some reason, there we are. Everyone sees the logic of that situation. All of us run and most of us die. Welcome to the dark side of rationality. All right. Let me give you a less exotic example, and one I actually observed back when I was a professor at UCLA. Just south of UCLA, there is a highway intersection which the locals claimed was the busiest intersection in the world. About 8 lanes, or maybe 10 lanes each way. And you observe what happens every day at rush hour is that cars are coming through on Westwood Avenue, and the light starts to change, and the last few cars try to get across, and when the light goes red, the result is that the intersection is jammed with cars. So the cars coming this way can't get through. Gradually, the cars filter out at this end, just in time for these cars to come down as the light turns red and jam the intersection that way. All right? Think about the logic of that situation. Every driver is doing the right thing. If all the drivers were polite and didn't pull into the intersection until they knew they could get across, everybody would get home faster. But my being polite going this way helps these guys. Their being polite helps these guys. So from the standpoint of each individual, he is better off pushing ahead, even though that jams the intersection. All right, so that's exactly the same logic, and again a situation where individual rationality is not producing group rationality. Finally, let me give you an even more familiar example to most of us, I think. You are sitting in a restaurant or a bar with some of your friends, and you're trying to have a nice conversation with them. And the only trouble is that the bar is a little bit noisy, because other people are having conversations too. And it's clear that the only thing you can do with a noisy restaurant is to speak a little bit louder. But oddly enough, they're all speaking a little bit louder too. So the only thing you can do is to speak a whole lot louder. And pretty soon, nobody can hear anybody, and we're all hoarse. All right? Logic of the situation is again the same. That raising my voice makes me a little more able to talk to the people around me, makes everybody else less able to hear things. We all do it, and we're all worse off as a result. So that's a case where each person is individually acting correctly, and yet the result is a perverse result. Let me now sketch the simple argument for freedom before telling you why it's wrong. All right, the simple argument for freedom is that each person acts in his own interest. Each, therefore, makes those decisions that maximize his net benefit, benefit minus cost. That maximizes net benefit summed over everybody, so there's no need for a government to intervene to change what people do. And what's wrong with that argument, I've just pointed out, that sometimes I get the benefit of my act and you get the cost, air pollution, dangerous driving, or just rude driving, and therefore I might do something even though the total cost to you plus me is bigger than the benefit to me, which makes us on net worse off. And economists call these situations negative externalities. Sometimes it's the other way around. Sometimes I pay the cost and you get the benefit. That's true of a radio broadcast. I can't control who listens to the broadcast, so I can't charge people for it. It's true of basic research, where I do research and other people take advantage of it to make improvements. Therefore, even if the benefit is larger than the cost, it might not pay me to do it. That misses an opportunity to make us on net better off. That's what economists call the public good problem. A public good is a good where the producer can't control who gets it. Right? Therefore, can't charge for it. Sometimes there are private solutions to these problems. Some externality problems can be dealt with by putting the two parties that affect each other inside a single firm. So if I provided a free parking lot, that would provide benefits for all the stores near me. Wouldn't pay me to do it. But if you have a shopping center where the whole shopping center belongs to one firm, the owner of the shopping center, the mall, provides free parking, and he charges for it in the rent he collects from the stores that are his tenants. He can also coordinate more complicated things. He can observe that more people are willing to go to a movie theater if there's a late-night restaurant near it so they can eat dinner afterwards. More people are willing to go to a late-night restaurant if there is a movie theater nearby to provide customers, so he can make sure when he's renting out his space in his shopping mall that he puts a late-night restaurant next to a movie theater. And you can think of lots and lots of other ways in which a shopping center has an incentive to solve these sorts of problems and thus coordinate and avoid market failure. On the other hand, there are other public good problems that can be dealt with by ingenuity. And my favorite example is the case of radio broadcasts. That it's clear there could never be private radio broadcasts because the broadcaster pays the cost of putting on a program and he can't charge the listeners for listening to it. But some unknown genius thought of the idea of producing not one public good but two. One public good which has a positive cost of production and a positive value to the consumers, and we call that a radio broadcast. And one public good that has a negative cost of production and a negative cost to the consumers, we call that an advertisement. It has a negative cost of production because a company will pay the radio program, the radio station, to put it on. You tie the two goods tightly together and you give away the bundle. And that's the way private radio and television were mostly financed. It's the way a lot of web pages in various ways are financed, and so forth. All right, so those are particular examples of ingenious solutions to problems of market failure. But they depend on those particular examples. There is no guarantee that you will always be able to find such a solution, and therefore there is no guarantee that individual rationality in a market will always produce group rationality. In that sense, the criticism is right. It follows that it is possible for government to step in to improve the situation by regulating air pollution and dangerous driving, thus preventing acts whose costs are larger than their benefits, improve it by subsidizing radio, television, basic research, thus getting goods produced whose benefit is larger than their cost. But there's a problem with this argument, and the problem is that for this to work, we need some mechanism that makes government make the right decisions. That after all, I've been assuming that people in the private market are each person is acting rationally in his own interest. There's no reason to make a different assumption about the public market. These are the same people after all. So we need some way that the rational choices of the political actors, the voters, the politicians, and the lobbyists, will add up to rational choices for the whole polity. Otherwise, you might find government intervention pushing things in the wrong direction, making things worse instead of better. And that brings us to the subject of market failure on the political market, because I'm going to argue that it is in fact a very common pattern responsible for many familiar problems. That if you think about it, most political decisions are made by people who neither pay the cost nor receive the benefit of their decision. That goes down to you people in the room. You're presumably voters. You as voters, when you vote, know that the benefit of voting for the right candidate, if it happens, if there is any benefit, will be spread among all the citizens of Norway. That the cost of figuring out who the right candidate is will be paid by you. Consequently, it is not in your interest to do it. A legislator who passes a bill is providing both costs and benefits to other people. A lobbyist who persuades a legislator to pass a bill is providing benefits to his customers at the cost of other people. A judge who makes decisions and sets precedents, those precedents will almost entirely result in cost and benefits to other people. So there is actually no reason to expect political actors to take the actions that maximize net benefit. And let's run through more carefully the examples, some of the examples mentioned. Let me start with the rationally ignorant voter. That there is a theory that I like to think of as the civics class model of democracy, or the naive model of democracy. And that says the reason democracy works is that if the politicians don't do the right things, we'll vote them out. And in order for that to work, the individual voter has to know whether the politician is doing the right thing. First, he has to know what the politician is doing. Then he has to know if it's the right thing. For some reason, politicians almost never run for office with the slogan, "I'm the bad guy." As far as I know, no congressman has ever introduced into the U.S. Congress a bill entitled, "A Bill to Make Farmers Richer and City Folks Poorer." We have such a bill every year. It's called the Farm Program. Its basic purpose is to make agricultural products more expensive. The EU has a similar set of policies. I don't know as much about it, and I don't know about Norway, but you probably do too. But they don't say that. And with a little bit of ingenuity, you can always label your program in a way which makes it look as though it's good for everybody. And that means that in order to figure out whether or not the politician you are voting for or against is really doing good things. You'd have to do a good deal of work and thought. You'd also have to spend a good deal of time following what he was doing, because after all, there are lots of votes in Congress, and I assume lots of votes in your parliament. If he votes against something you're in favor and you ask him, he might say, well, yes, I was in favor of it too, but I had to trade that vote for a vote on something more important. It might be true. Or else I voted that one down because I'm trying to get an even better bill of the same sort. So it's a non-trivial project to be a well-informed, rational voter. And there's no incentive to do it, because you know that your vote has almost no chance of changing the outcome, even in a country as small as Norway, even less obviously in the US. And if by any unlikely chance it does change it, that benefit will go almost all to other people, only a little bit to you. So you end up with voters who are rationally ignorant, and they support policies that sound good to people who don't know anything about them. He has no incentive to be better informed. You get a politics of sound bites and demagoguery. And the most important question for every voter is, if I vote this way, will my friends think well of me? That is to say, the effect of going along with whatever your social group is a much stronger effect on you than any effect your vote actually has on political outcomes. Let me give you another example of market failure, that one of the claims that is sometimes made about the need for the government is that people are short-sighted and we need government to take a long view. And that's precisely the opposite of the correct way of looking at that situation. And the question is, how do you get people to bear costs now for future benefits? Black walnut trees are a very pretty kind of lumber, but they're slow-growing trees. I haven't actually checked, but let's assume it's 40 years from planting to harvest. And I'm thinking about buying some land and planting it with black walnut trees. I'm 73 years old. So it looks as though I obviously shouldn't do it. But that's wrong, because I can plant the land with black walnut trees. 10 years from now, land with 10-year-old black walnut trees is worth more than bare land. So I can sell that to somebody else. Maybe he waits 30 years, maybe he waits 10 years and sells it to somebody else. But it in fact pays me as a rational, self-interested individual to make investments that will not pay off till after my death, because I can transfer those investments and get my part of the payoff now. However, there is a condition to that. It only works if I can reasonably be sure that when the black walnut trees are harvested, they will still belong either to me or the person I sold them to or the person he sold them to. Suppose that I believe that every year, once the black walnut trees are big enough to be of some value, there's a significant probability that some enterprising person will drive on at night with a pickup truck and a chainsaw and drive off with my half-grown black walnut trees. Or alternatively, suppose I believe that every year there's a chance that some enterprising politician will persuade the legislature that black walnut trees are a national resource and therefore ought to belong to the government and not to selfish capitalist entrepreneurs. Right? If either of those is the case, I will only plant those trees if the payoff is very, very high, enough to allow for the sizable risk of losing it. Right? So that means what that depends on is secure property rights. You need a system where whatever the relevant rights are, you can be reasonably sure that the person who has them will keep them, except when he chooses to transfer them. Politicians have insecure property rights. As I used to say a few presidents ago, Clinton could rent out the White House, but he couldn't sell it. That a politician who does politically costly things now that provide a benefit to his successors 20 years later, by which time he is out of office, is a very foolish man. All right, the odds are about 50-50 it'll be the other party. Almost certainly it won't be him. You can only be president for 8 years in the U.S. So if you imagine when I gave this talk in Rio de Janeiro, I had been told about the problems they had had providing water to their population because they should have been making maintenance and improvements in the water system in Rio 10 or 20 years earlier. But 10 or 20 years earlier, it made more sense for the mayor to spend that money on welfare to voters or on money to people who would donate to his campaign, to things that would give him an immediate benefit rather than to things that would solve a problem 20 years down the road. And if you actually look at sort of what's going on before an election, it is reasonably clear that what the politicians care about is what will be the unemployment rate as of the election. What will be the inflation rate as of the election? And for all of the rhetoric, things farther down the road are very much less heavily weighted. Now, interestingly enough, politicians frequently pretend to be interested in the future. And there's a good reason for that, because the voters can't see the future. So therefore, as long as the politician says what I'm doing will give you a benefit in the future, he has some chance of people believing him. They can't know that he's lying. And therefore, he may be able to get voters to accept real costs now for imaginary benefits in the future. And in fact, I believe the champion of this particular strategy was an enterprising gentleman from the country of what's now the country of Georgia by the name of Joseph Stalin. That Stalin could not persuade the Russians that they had it well now. That in Moscow, which was about the best place in Russia to be, families were living a family to a room. But he could say to them, yes, we have it hard. Yes, we are making sacrifices. But we're making these sacrifices so that your children will be as rich as the Americans and your grandchildren will be richer than the Americans. And for a while, he could pull it off. You can't pull that off forever, but you can pull it off for a while. But if you look at how politicians actually act, they decide what to do by the effects on the next election, not by what will be good for the country 20 years or 40 years or 100 years down the road. Let me give you another example of market failure on the political market, and that's lethal caution in drug regulation. I'm talking now of medical drugs. Recreational drugs are a different set of issues. But think about it from the standpoint of a regulator in charge of something like the agency in the U.S. that approves new medical drugs. If he approves a drug and it turns out there's an unknown side effect that kills 20 people, his career is more or less finished. On the other hand, if he is a careful, cautious person and he says, well, we need another study, we need some more evidence before we approve it, and kills 100 people, that pays no cost. Because the way you kill 100 people is that there is a drug that currently has a cure rate of 80%. There's a new drug with a cure rate of 85%. You keep that new drug off the market for a decade. The result is that each year a few people are dying who would otherwise live, but nobody knows who. You don't get a front page photo out of statistical deaths. And the result is that he is better off being lethally cautious. And my standard example of this was the press release some years back when the US FDA confessed to killing 100,000 people. Now, for some reason, that's not the way they worded the press release. There had been a controversy for quite a while over a class of drugs called beta blockers, which are used to prevent a second heart attack. And they had been in use in Europe for something like 10 or 12 years before the FDA decided to approve one of them as a beta blocker. And the FDA announced in their press release that they expected that its use would save 8,000 to 10,000 lives a year. Well, if its use saves 8,000 to 10,000 lives a year, and you were preventing its use for 10 to 12 years, that meant you killed about 100,000 people. And yet I don't remember seeing any headlines, kick out the FDA people, look at all the people they've killed. Let me give you another example, and this is one that economists are particularly fond of because it's a case where economics not only tells you that you'll get market failure, it tells you how it'll happen. It tells you what mistakes the political system will make. Let's consider an auto tariff in a country like the U.S. that produces autos. An auto tariff benefits car makers and their workers at the cost of consumers and farmers. Now, you may say, why at the cost of farmers? Because the U.S. actually has two different technologies for making cars. We can build cars in Detroit, and we can grow cars in Iowa. And the way you grow cars in Iowa is that you grow the raw material cars are made out of, which is called corn. You put it on a ship. You send the ship out into the Pacific Ocean, and it comes back with Hondas on it. All right, that's a technology for growing cars. And what a tariff is doing is taxing that technology vis-a-vis the technology for building cars in Detroit. As I like to say, it is not protecting American auto workers from Japanese auto workers, it's protecting American auto workers from American farmers. But think about the politics of it for a moment, because this again involves a public good problem. The public good problem here is the public good problem faced by an interest group. Imagine that you are, say, the president of Ford Motors, and you say to yourself, we could lobby for that tariff. We could offer to make cash contributions to the campaign funds of congressmen who are good, patriotic Americans and realize we have to protect Americans, especially us. But, of course, if I do that and we get it through, it'll benefit not just us, it'll benefit GM, it'll benefit all of the U.S. auto workers, and it'll benefit the United Auto Workers, our union, too, so maybe I shouldn't do it. But then I think, wait a minute, that's not very many people, right? There are only a handful of auto companies. There's one big union. Let's have a meeting. Let's get together and discuss the health of the American auto industry. And we're willing to put up $50 million. If you, GM's bigger than we are, if you'll put up $100 million, and if the UAW will make it clear that congressmen who support the auto tariff are good, patriotic Americans who all American workers ought to vote for, if each of us puts in our inputs, we can buy an auto tariff. And because there are only a few of us, we can largely solve our little public good problem for the auto industry, because with small numbers, you can agree, I'll do it if you do it. So if we imagine that the tariff is worth $10 billion to the auto industry, almost certainly the auto industry can raise at least $1 billion to buy the tariff. Now, the same tariff costs, let us say, $100 billion to the victims, to the consumers and the farmers. But the consumers and the farmers are almost 300 million people spread across the country with no organization representing them as a group. So from their standpoint, if it costs $100 billion, they're never going to be able to raise anything like $1 billion in order to oppose it. And if you actually watch the politics, the people who oppose things like tariffs on foreign autos are generally the American dealers who sell foreign autos, because there are few enough of them so that although they're paying a tiny part of the cost, they can at least organize. So what this suggests is that you would expect, as a general rule, that it is politically profitable to benefit concentrated interest groups at the cost of dispersed groups, even if the cost is much larger than the benefits. And tariffs are sort of a standard case in the public choice literature, because economists have known for about 200 years that a tariff, with rare exceptions, hurts the country that imposes it. Nonetheless, almost all countries in the world have tariffs. Why? Because a tariff benefits the protected industry, which is usually a relatively small group of firms, at the cost of consumers and exporters who are a very large group. Hence, it is a way of benefiting a concentrated interest group at the expense of a dispersed interest group. So the conclusion of my argument is that on the private market, individuals must usually pay for what they use. They usually get paid for what they produced, but there are exceptions. There are sometimes situations where they don't, and therefore market failure sometimes occurs, and therefore the private laissez-faire market sometimes produces things that shouldn't be produced or fails to produce things that should be. On the political market, individuals almost never bear the costs or receive the benefits of their actions. They have no incentive to make the choices that maximize net benefits for all, and we would therefore expect market failure to be common. And that explains why it is that market failure does a better job of predicting political outcomes than of predicting market outcomes. On the private market, market failure theory demonstrates that radio and television programs are never produced. And yet, in fact, they are produced. That externalities are never controlled, but in fact they often are. Compare a large shopping mall, which is sort of a private village, with a small town which is public, and ask which typically is cleaner and safer. Right? On the public market, on the other hand, although the economic argument for protective tariffs is 2 centuries out of date, most countries have tariffs because they benefit the concentrated interest at the cost of the dispersed interest. As Gary Becker, a no longer living interesting economist, pointed out, farm policy, mostly the world divides into two kinds of countries. In countries where the farmers are a small minority of the population, the purpose of farm policy is to make farmers rich at the cost of everybody else, because small groups are politically concentrated. In countries where there are a lot of farmers, where there are most of the population, farm policy is designed to hold down crop prices in order to buy the support of the urban mob, which is more politically effective at the expense of the dispersed peasants. And that's precisely the opposite of what you would expect from the naive model of democracy, which would say if there are lots of farmers, they're politically powerful. If there are few, they're politically weak. Right? So my conclusion so far is that market failure is an argument for government intervention in markets, but a stronger argument against, once one remembers to apply the same analysis to both. Once one remembers that both private and public actors should be thought of as rational individuals seeking their own objectives, not as benevolent demigods deciding what's good for the world and then doing it. Enough about politics, because market failure turns out to be relevant to a whole lot of other things. Let me go back to the Battle of Clontarf, or more generally, the argument for why armies run away. It suggests that the way to win battles is to somehow organize the battle in such a way that it's in the interest of the other guide's troops to run away, and then you don't have to fight them. All right? How to run a firm: try to design a firm so that reward corresponds to contribution, which may involve subdividing a firm into mini firms for accounting purposes, so you can say this part of the firm is making us money, this part losing money, fire that guy, promote that guy, or give bonuses or whatever. Let me take an example in my field, and this is what I like to refer to as the silent student problem. The silent student problem occurs when I have just finished explaining something that I have explained 100 times before and could explain in my sleep. And I say to my students, now, did anybody have any trouble understanding the principle of comparative advantage? And nobody raises his hand. And I only discover my mistake when I grade the final exam. What's going on? The students are rational. Each student says to himself, well, maybe the other students understood it. I didn't. If I say I didn't understand it, I'll look stupid to the other students, and I don't want to do that. I want status with my peers. I'll look stupid to the professor, and he may give me a worse grade. So I'll just keep quiet, and maybe if someone else didn't understand it, they'll ask. All right, rational behavior. Well, I have a solution to this problem. I admit I'm only a theorist. I haven't implemented the solution. But the solution goes as follows. You arrange your classroom so that at every place there is a button discreetly sitting on the floor that a student can push with his toe without anybody seeing what he's doing. And at the back of the room there is a sign which shows how many buttons are pushed. So I say, well, everybody who clearly understood the principle of comparative advantage, please press your button. And the number 2 appears on the screen at the back of the hall, and I go over and explain it again. Right? So that would be an example of engineering, or what I think of as engineering around market failure. Let me go on to how to run a household. As it happens, both my wife and I cook. And sometimes she cooks dinner and sometimes I cook dinner. And there are 2 ways we could organize this. We could say that when she cooks dinner, I clean up, and when I cook dinner, she cleans up. Or we could say when she cooks dinner, she cleans up, and when I cook dinner, I clean up. And the question is, which is the right way to do it? And I'm interested in opinions only from people who cook. Like many other issues, it depends on understanding the technology to make sense of economics. So which way should we do it? Should I clean up when I cook, or should she clean up when I cook and I clean up when she cooks? Any opinions? Yes?
If you're self-interest, you will probably cook because you have no incentive to doesn't make a mess.
That's right, because when you are cooking, there are a whole bunch of decisions that you make that affect how much cleaning up has to be done. Do you do a one-pot meal or something that involves a frying pan, a saucepan, and a broiler? Do you take the 5 minutes when the water is coming to a boil for the spaghetti to clean out the frying pan that you were using in the first stage of making the spaghetti sauce? Do you? You've got a whole bunch of choices. Now, I love my wife, it's true, and I would prefer not to make a mess for her either, but I'm much more conscious of the mess that I make for myself. And consequently, if I follow the rule, which I should say is the rule we do follow, which is that if I cook, I'm responsible for cleaning up. She's allowed to help if she wants. I'm allowed to help if I want. But the basic responsibility is to the cook to clean up after himself or herself. That is, in fact, I think, the economically correct solution for reasons that ultimately come down to my discussion of market failure. The point I want to make to you is that market failure isn't just a political slogan. It's a real issue in human activities which runs through everything we do and which is a useful way of thinking about how to organize your life. All right? The same thing applies to our interactions with our small children. Imagine that your 3-year-old has just made a mess. He's just dumped out all of the Legos onto the floor. And there are 2 alternatives. You could clean them up or he could clean them up. Getting him to clean them up will take you more time than cleaning them up yourself. Nonetheless, you make him clean up her mess because if you clean up the mess, there's no reason he shouldn't do it again tomorrow. All right? So the basic logic is the same. Finally, I said I was going to talk about ways of making money. So I want to suggest that market failure is also a profit opportunity, because the existence of market failure implies that there's some other way of doing things which would produce a net improvement. All right, if we say at the moment we are failing to do something whose benefits are larger than its costs, if only you could figure out a solution to that, figure out some way that as well as bearing the cost, you could also get a lot of the benefits, you could pocket some of that difference. So that means that an entrepreneur who figures out how to get that outcome might end up with some of the gain. So, for example, the first person who thought of combining advertisements with radio television broadcasts. Or Google, which thought of the idea of giving away a search engine and charging firms for being found, which is their basic model. Or the first shopping center solving externalities by putting many stores under one roof. I want to sort of end the discussion of designing around market failure by telling you a story that I like. This one is purely fictional, but I like it anyway. And we are now going to, instead of being in Ireland, we're now in Arabia. And there are 2 Bedouins riding their camels through the desert of Arabia with an oasis a couple of miles away. And one of the Bedouins starts complaining about his camel. This snail I'm riding, disguised as a camel, has got to be the slowest beast in all of the deserts of Arabia. And the other Bedouin says, you think that camel is slow? This rock I'm riding on is slower still. And they get into an argument about whose camel is slower. And finally they agree on a bet, that if whichever Bedouin's camel gets to the oasis last, his owner wins the bet, and the other one must pay him a golden dinar. Well, you can see what will happen, of course. One of the Bedouins starts going slowly, and the other more slowly, and the other more slowly still, because they want to win the bet. And an hour later, there are 2 Bedouins sitting their camels stock still in the blazing sun in the middle of the desert of Arabia with the oasis still a mile away. At this point, a wise man comes walking by, and he looks at the 2 of them, and he says, why are you 2 idiots sitting your camels stock still in the blazing sun in the middle of the desert of Arabia with the oasis a mile away? And the 2 Bedouins get off their horses, got off their camels in order to explain the problem to him. And the wise man says 2 words to them, and they leap on the camels and ride off as fast as ever they can. You answered the last time. Anybody else want to answer? The bet is on the camels, not the Bedouins. So when I jump on your camel, I want it to go as fast as possible. When you jump on my camel, I want it to go as fast as possible. Consequently, we have just reversed the incentives and eliminated that particular piece of market failure. I like this story. All right, if you want lots and lots more stuff, I have a website. That website, with luck, I can even bring up here. Here it is. Well, it's on my machine, isn't it? Oh, is it? This thing is using other way. Very good. All right, that does it. Thank you. That's my web page. It has links to the full text of about 3 or 4 of my books. It has links to a whole lot of talks like this on a lot of different subjects. It has links to most of my academic articles and most of my popular articles. It's also got about 300 medieval recipes, because one of my and my wife's hobbies is cooking from very old cookbooks, and lots of other interesting stuff. I also have a blog, and the easiest way of finding the blog is to follow the link that's near the top of my web page. And the blog is called Ideas, and it's wherever I feel like talking about something. So it covers a very wide variety of different issues, including child rearing, in particular home unschooling, climate change, and I don't remember, 20 other things, I suppose. So anyway, if you want more of the kind of stuff I've been talking about, it's all out there for free. The web is a rather clumsy mechanism for selling information, but a beautiful, lovely mechanism for giving information away. Google figured that out, which is how they made billions of dollars. And I do it on a somewhat smaller scale, but at least it results in my getting invitations to come to nice places like Oslo with someone else paying for it. Thank you.